Picture this, Will.
Okay, my eyes are closed.
The year was 2014.
Fine vintage.
Yes. I, previously just a member of the Giant Bombcast, suddenly found myself the host.
Oh, yeah.
Perhaps you remember, and had really not edited much audio to speak of, except for, necessity arises and like everybody has to mess with audio a little bit here and there, right?
Yeah.
Like maybe you made a ringtone for your first iPhone or something. Like everybody's touched an audio editor at some point, but not on this scale.
I had a very similar experience when I started at Whiskey Media in 2010, and we recorded the first episode of the Tested podcast, and I got done with it. I was like, hey, Mike Tatum, who's the editor that I hand this off to? And he's like, oh, wait, that's you. And I was like, well, I've never done that before. He's like, well, no time like the present to learn.
Yep.
And so then I talked to our mutual friend, Ryan Davis, and he ran me through the high level using GarageBand methods of editing podcasts.
It's a startup. You're going to do everything yourself. Well, guess what? Then we got to a giant corporation and we were still having to do everything ourselves. So,
you know what? I kind of like doing that part myself now.
No, you're not wrong.
Yeah.
Yes. Time allowing, I prefer to do everything myself anyway.
Yes.
We've talked about this before, I think, but or I've mentioned this in other quarters at least. The corporate procurement process was such that I was like, well, I could put in a request on the help desk for some software, and maybe they'll buy it for me in a month, or I could just go download Audacity.
It was a bold choice, given that at that time Audacity was still a destructive editor.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Okay.
I never had a problem.
Okay.
I made it work. I mean, that's kind of the point, though. I made it work, right? Like, it was there. It was freely available.
Yeah.
It had, 14 years at that point worth of documentation built up online about it. And again, it was freely available because it's free and open source audio editor. And so I cut my teeth editing one of the biggest gaming podcasts out there on Audacity. And the rest is history.
Welcome to the FOSSPod. I'm Will.
I'm Brad.
As always, Brad, this week's episode of the FOSSPod is brought to you by Google Open Source. They bring all the value of open source to Google and all the resources of Google to open source. You can find out more at opensource.google. But this week on the FOSSPod, we're talking with Martin Keary, who's the head of product at Audacity and Muse Score.
Yes, also YouTube's Tantacruel.
Also YouTube. He's a multi-hyphenate, I think is what you call a person like Martin.
A polymath. A prominent YouTuber, in fact.
Yeah, he's an interesting interview for us, not just because we love Audacity and use it literally multiple times a week. I've been using Audacity for as long as we've been doing this podcast. It's always been my go-to tool for recording something on the desktop for as long as I can remember. But Martin's an interesting interview for us because his specialty isn't writing code, but he's a user interface and user experience design expert who also has a background as a musician. He talks a lot about user experience design on his YouTube channel. He's been working at Muse Score for, I think he said, about 2 years now. And these are a couple of the few open source projects that design and user experience I feel like they're a forethought rather than something that comes after.
Yeah. He's also one of these people that I love talking to because his original background has absolutely nothing to do with computers.
Yeah.
He's a musician originally and has been in bands and toured in bands and went to conservatory. So very much is coming at this stuff from a musical background as well as an interface and design background. But, he worked for Canonical on the mobile version of Ubuntu.
For phones.
Yes. Worked at Microsoft, has worked in mobile gaming, has done a lot of stuff around user interface in other types of software.
And the other thing that's of note is that Audacity is one of the older open source projects that we've spoken to. It's been around since 2000. It's been up and down over that time. There have been periods of really fast development and periods of kind of slower development over the years. And we've talked about projects that are, in early stages, in midlife. This is the first project we've talked to a maintainer of who's a second generation maintainer of that project. This is a product that's transitioned from the original creators and the early maintainers into an entirely new infrastructure for the entire project over the last couple of years. And it's an interesting place to find out, how it's going and how Martin is taking over the stewardship of this project from the original crew.
Yeah, we'll link to his YouTube channel in the show notes. He's got some good videos up on just kind of the history of Audacity, talking to, I mean, it started at a university, you know, he talks to the professor who was the original head of the project and some stuff like that. But it's a really interesting time for the application now because they're in a period of rapid growth. Like I say this in the interview, I think they have added more new features to Audacity in the last year since they've been stewarding it than they had in like the last 7 years before that. It's really growing quickly and maturing quickly. And it's really interesting to see that playing out, hear his thoughts on why and how it's playing out. Also get some nice teasers again, self-indulgently as a user of the software, some good teases for some more features that are coming soon.
It's a really fascinating place for the project to be. It's an exciting time for users of Audacity. And I'm really thrilled to talk to Martin about the state of the project and where they're taking it going forward. With a big project like this, especially with something that's used as broadly, because I think we'll probably talk about it a little bit, but I mean, when we were looking for different uses of Audacity, everyone from people like us, podcasters and musicians and folks like that, to scientific researchers and people who just want to do weird stuff with audio, all use Audacity to different purposes. It's got to be an incredible UX challenge to hone down this seemingly infinite number of use cases into one application that is accessible to a normal human the first time they pick it up.
Yeah, there definitely is a sort of like you say, sort of an academic who's using a spectrogram to assess audio versus a lot of people who do, let's say, podcast production. And then there's a few people who, they may not write music in Audacity, but they use Audacity specifically for musical use cases, They might write the music somewhere else, or they record themselves playing music or something like that. They all have very different needs, and when we speak to them, they all use very different parts of the app. And I think that that's the sort of the game beyond the game, is to make the experience of Audacity, basically you install it, you open it up, and right at the very beginning, you are given the right options that allow you to customize, let's say, the interface in such a way so that if you, for example, really love the way Audacity is right now or was 2 versions ago, the UI will sort of update to show you those options, to prioritize the stuff that you think is important. If you're a musician and we build future features like, beats and measures, for example, which is something that, Google Summer Code Project has implemented that recently, and we're going to merge it quite soon. The second you introduce, let's say, the example of, beats and measures, that kind of flies in the face of a lot of what other people would use Audacity for. So you need to make sure that you don't just attach that on to the UI, and yet it's yet another thing that makes it even more complicated. You need to be a bit more clever about that. So that's the challenge with Audacity. You can't lock off a segment. It is a really, really powerful audio editor, and it's a really good analysis tool. And we have to make sure that it's better at doing that, not that one sort of use case suffers at the expense, because we decided to prioritize another one or something like that. So that's a biggie for us, The thing is, in the case of Audacity, they have everything they need to be that way because it's heavily customizable, which I always notice is a FOSS thing in general. There's a lot of emphasis on customization, different color themes, being able to move the interface around into different sort of positions and stuff. That whole idea is actually really, really useful to creating systems that allow you to interface to, let's say, just change depending on what you want it to do, and there's a couple of examples out there of apps that do that. I'd say Premiere, for example, obviously not an open source product, but depending on what kind of editing I want to do, they've got a couple of very easy to access workspaces where if I say just a basic editing suite, I just want one window, nothing too fancy. It lays that out for me, and I can save a particular other type of customization if I want to. So I think that they can be achieved. You just need to really plan it, and you need to make sure that you understand all the use cases, that you're not accidentally going to screw someone over,
So with that kind of background of having used it yourself in mind, what did you feel like was the biggest burning priority when you first came on to running the project?
I don't know what I first thought it was. I could probably go back over my notes, but it would take forever and be really boring. But what did I think initially? I felt that I had never figured out how to move a waveform. I always thought that waveforms were stuck and you couldn't move them left or right. And it was super, super awkward to manipulate anything that was a multi-track project. I found that incredibly strange. But the thing is, the users, and I've done so much research on so many different apps, and I found this time and time again, most users do not invest the time to go and figure out how an application actually works in a holistic way. Very few people go, right, left to right, let's figure out what everything does. They usually go, I want to accomplish this particular thing, let's try this free software. And depending on how many W2F moments I encounter, I may get it done, or I may say, screw this, I'll never touch it again, So for me, Audacity was limited because I didn't know it could do more. I didn't know of the things it was able to do. I didn't know that it had the concept of, for example, audio clips. I don't think a lot of people knew that. It had the concept of audio clips already. They just were visualized in such a way, and they were not movable, that they just were basically invisible to people like me. I never actually got that far. And also the documentation, which supposedly explains to you how these things work, was kind of non-existent. Well, that's not true. It existed. It was just in a place that was very hard to find, written in a way that was very hard to parse and understand. And I guess the thing that first struck me was, oh my God, once I got the breakdown of all the technicalities and all the things that Audacity was capable of, I thought to myself, well, on paper, it's got just about everything you need to be a really good production, like podcasting production app. Except for, I don't know how to move waveforms around. The ability to sort of non-destructively edit volume over time seemed like a deal breaker to me, even though that does exist. I didn't know it existed at the time. And I also felt that like real-time effects was a big limitation to it as well. Like, for example, Audition, I use that quite a lot, and I make a lot of use of the fact that that has real-time effects. And it felt to me just that was a massive limitation. And also non-destructive editing was another one as well. But I think the very first thing that occurred to me was, it's amazing to me that it has the concept of clips and you can actually move waveforms left and right. I never realized you could do that. And I went and ran a bunch of tests, and I gave people the job of, imagine you're creating a podcast. Here are 3 tracks. All I want you to do is just arrange them in a couple of different ways to get this visual result. And you're already, by asking them to do that, giving away that it's possible. You know what I mean? So you're already doing more than what a normal user would experience. And every single one of them just failed. They were not Audacity users. It was their first time experience. And I thought, well, we have to solve that. The things Audacity can already do should be more obvious.
I have to say, everything you just said is speaking to me very deeply. I've been using Audacity on a weekly basis to edit podcasts for about 8 years now. And yes, moving the little text title bar on each track, on each clip, to just click and drag and move clips around is like a pretty recent and very welcome addition. Like, I would say, starting with probably with non-destructive editing, and then like 3.2 obviously is a pretty huge release in terms of new features. Like, that's more active development, more new features being added in like just the last year-ish or so than in the previous like 7 or so that I've seen in my own use. Like, did that take a lot of like reaching into the plumbing of the program and like really digging into ancient code, or like how hard has it been to take a project that, like, I don't want to use the word stagnant, but it had been like fairly slow moving from my perspective, and like really just start cranking out this new stuff? Like, how hard was that?
To the credit of the previous team, their focus was to not overdo. They wanted to make sure that it was as stable as humanly possible, and they really focused a lot on that. And I seem to recall it was every 6 months they get a release out, generally speaking, and they wouldn't go too gung ho with features, and they made sure that they tested it to the nth degree and everything. And I think they just had a very different mindset, and I think their mindset was, we have millions and millions of users. They use it for a reason, and our responsibility to them is to make sure the app is as stable as humanly possible. And they weren't a very large team, and obviously they were doing other things with their lives. So yeah, that was kind of their mindset. But yeah, I would say that Audacity, in terms of its feature set, kind of stayed still for quite a while. They did some other things. They changed the file format with version 3, for example. Sure. But yeah, when we did, in particular, non-destructive editing and non-destructive effects, that required, as our developers put it, just like interfacing with code that was written 20 years ago or 15 years ago, and massive rewrites to all kinds of aspects of the way that the app worked. Especially non-destructive effects or rather real-time effects, was a gigantic overhaul required to do that. Another thing which will be coming soon, we were kind of thinking of putting it in this release, but maybe it'll be not a patch release, but the next kind of proper release, let's say like a 3.3 or 3.4, are all the performance improvements that we've done. We just thought it would make the app too unstable to try and include that with real-time effects. But for example, Audacity runs, I think it's like 15 frames a second or possibly 12 frames a second at the moment, which is just due to the fact that its UI is very, very power hungry, and it just wouldn't work if you tried to set that higher. It's arbitrarily set to that low frame rate just because it'll kill your computer if you try to raise it higher. It can now run theoretically at like 300 FPS, but we're going to set it to 60. So there will be very soon like a very notable difference in the performance of Audacity. It'll feel different. It'll feel like a more modern application quite soon, just for that one thing alone. But it also will open and load files much, much faster than before. All the effects will work much, much better than they do now. And that's another bit of, like, there's a lot of under the hood stuff happening, way more under the hood stuff happening than actual feature development.
How much complexity does supporting multiple CPU architectures across 3 OSs add to a project like this?
I can't give specific details, but our bug triage list is always right: Linux, Mac, PC, and sometimes you'll just see the same problem come up 3 times over and they have 3 different solutions. So yeah, it's just, I think in particular Linux, because of all the different distros, it incurs quite a lot of extra testing and extra issues and stuff. And we have to dedicate a reasonable amount of time to make sure that all works out well. But I don't know specifically, I couldn't give you the technical details.
So I'd love to talk just some nitty gritty about, GUI libraries, cross-platform libraries, like what tech is being used here and what potential you see in the future. Like the UI in my memory, I think I used Audacity like in college 20 years ago very briefly and then picked it back up about 8. I want to say it's been using kind of the same GUI toolkit that entire time. Do you know if that's accurate?
Yeah, it's been using, it's WX widgets.
Right.
And the advantage of WX widgets, the reason it was chosen at the time was because it worked really well with the sort of native interfaces of Mac and PC and Linux. And it wasn't really set up so that you could do loads of customization. It was sort of meant to be that if it's on Mac, it'll look and feel like it's a Mac application, etc. And the only problem is, that might have been true 20 or 15 years ago. It's just now what you have is a Windows version, and the Windows version looks much nicer than the Mac version, like much, much nicer. And the Mac version sort of feels like, I don't know, OS 9 almost at this stage. It just feels absolutely ancient. And when we try to make any changes to the interface, for example, just changing a button or creating any new bit of interface, WX Widgets resists that enormously. So it's incredibly difficult to just do a basic UI change, including adding all the accessibility stuff on top of that and making sure that the theming all works. Well, the theming isn't the hard part. It's really the accessibility part. That's the hard part, the focus states and screen reader support and all that. So it does act as a massive disincentive to change the interface or the visuals of the interface too much. We do that quite carefully and quite lightly. We do have a complete overhaul redesign of the application sort of already made, which we're constantly improving upon, but we don't want to do that in WX Widgets. The plan is to eventually move over to Qt, so replatforming to Qt, at which point more than likely we build the components using QML. We actually have a library which we built for Muse Score over about 2 years of every single type of UI component you can imagine, like an operating system's amount of UI, and we're planning on reusing that and modifying it for Audacity. But that's a bit of a long-term project.
One of the places that open source software seems to fall down fairly regularly, even in applications that are kind of passing that threshold. There's a moment that we've noticed in a lot of consumer applications where the application quietly improves and improves over a period of time until suddenly it's the best project in that category, the best piece of software in that category, or definitely one of the top contenders. And one of the things that falls by the wayside in that process, in that timeline often, and then comes back in later, if we're lucky, is the accessibility side. And you've mentioned it a couple of times already today. I'm curious what your efforts are towards accessibility in Audacity. I have to imagine it's a daunting problem, as complicated as the software is and as kind of wide-ranging as the scope of the users and use cases are.
I think in order to do accessibility well, you have to have someone on your team who has proper experience with it in one way, shape, or form. For example, we have one community member who's incredibly dedicated just to accessibility on Audacity and has been for years. And I'm not certain exactly why. I'm not certain what his background is, but that's just his main focus. Maybe he learned it all himself, or maybe he worked in a company that just focused on accessible design. But speaking for myself, working at Microsoft, they have a rule where nothing gets into Windows. No application can be released on Windows unless it completely fits in with their accessibility sort of mechanics. So things like high contrast mode and screen reader support, and every single action should be accessible via a keyboard or keyboard shortcut or whatever. So I really cut my teeth in Microsoft. And when I came, first of all, to MuseScore, we were lucky that MuseScore already had some accessibility features, and we just looked at those. And when we were redoing the interface, that's the perfect time to plan out how accessibility should work, because you really kind of need to do it when you're planning your interface. You need to know it's coming. If you try to build it on top of what you've built before, it becomes really hard to rationalize, And it can be done. Of course, it can be done. With Audacity, I would say that the accessibility was already in a pretty good place. Like a lot of blind users use Audacity. I'm a part of a blind user mailing list, and it's the most active mailing list we have. And one of the things we're really we don't yet know exactly how we're going to achieve it, but my feeling about accessibility with Audacity in particular is when we make the move over, we should maintain the accessibility as it is at the moment and then continue on improving it. But I can definitely say, having been I've had a couple of experiences working on an application where accessibility was an afterthought, and someone went, "Oh dear, we should really have accessibility on this." Some basic stuff like focus states or something. And if you do it that way, you are in so much trouble. So I think that you really need to plan this stuff, and even the way that you design buttons needs to be considered in accordance with accessibility, so that if there's a big white, generally speaking for focus states, you should have a big white and black outline around anything that you're focused on. This is specifically for screen readers. Sometimes it becomes impossible if, let's say, everything's cramped together, that line, you can't see it. Or you've designed the interface in such a way that it would make that line really hard to spot anyway. I mean, and there's different kinds of accessibility too. You should be thinking about accessibility when you're just making your standard interface. Fonts should not go lower than 12 point size, unless in some very specific circumstances, you should pass the contrast threshold of, 4.5 to 1? Like all the time. That's quite hard to do. Like a lot of designers will just kind of skip past that one, make lots of really faint looking UI that you can't read. And you're hurting, if you've got an app that goes out to millions of people, you're hurting hundreds of thousands of people who have poor contrast perception or dyslexia or something like that. So, there's different like tiers of accessible design. And I think another one as well, a very important one, is making sure that you don't rely on abstract icons all the time, depending on what it is you're making. If you're making a music player, you can get away with the play button looking like an icon, but you have to make sure that if a blind user is using it and they focus on that play button, that it is passing the term play, to the screen reader. And this has to be done for every single bit of the UI, and you've got hundreds, if not thousands, of little instances of UI all over your app, and therefore hundreds, if not thousands, of bugs that they have to prioritize. And it's an ongoing thing, and sometimes things just break unexpectedly. So you have to keep maintaining it all the time too. Yeah, I think I answered your question by talking about the general concept of accessibility and UI. But
well, I mean, no regressions to the UI changeover is good to hear, right? Like maintaining existing levels and then moving forward.
We couldn't drop accessibility. We couldn't do that. We couldn't go, right, let's make the UI look great and then we'll plug back in accessibility. That's an obscene thing to do, yeah. And I think we've got a good track record here because we're about to release Muse Core 4, and we haven't just built back in accessibility. We've made it much more accessible than it was before, much more screen reader support. We've rationalized the way that you can navigate using your keyboard to kind of fit in with the more sort of standard ways that it behaves in. Not to mention things like we now have a high contrast mode in Muse Core, which we didn't have before. Yeah, so it's much more accessible across, I think, no matter what way you look at it. And we plan to do the same thing with Audacity too,
Well, if you change the GUI libraries, will that require plugin rewrites and like community support for that initiative? Like
the replatforming, going from WX widgets to Qt, I mean, we want to keep as much. Basically, the only thing we want to try and change is the UI itself. Like even the wave rendering, we want to try and maintain that and move that over. The hope is that we want to remove all the sort of dependencies that exist at the moment and separate out the codes that only the UI is the thing that we remove. But we will have to completely remake just about every single visual element, including all the elements for the plugins and stuff like that too. Thankfully, a lot of the plugins are all just using the standard components that come with WX widgets, but there are a couple of examples of things like, I think there's like a couple of custom EQ type interfaces that have been built that we'll have to kind of remake again. But we're going to do it all ourselves. That's something where we wouldn't burden the community with that. And this is the same with Muse Core. When the replatforming job is one that we're doing kind of so that all of us can have a playground to work in the future. That's much more sophisticated, much easier to work in, much faster. But we generally find that it's so complicated and requires so much sort of day-to-day work among like 3, 4, 5 developers that, usually community developers can't really participate, very deeply in that. So we sort of feel that that's sort of a bit of work that we'll have to take on ourselves and get it done as quick as possible. And other people can, and that's exactly what happened with Muse Core 2,
I realize this is a dangerous question. Feel free to decline to answer, but like you talk about like the performance improvements you've been working on, like even those are a like 3.4 type addition. Like is this UI overhaul, the move to Qt that you're talking about, do you have any kind of timeline at all in mind for that? Is that like an Audacity 4.0 or a 5.0 thing? Is that a good ways off?
It's impossible to tell at the moment. What we're currently doing is a lot of sort of architecture work, a lot of what we're calling devendoring, in order to it's stuff we know has to be done in order to make the move. So there's one developer in particular whose job is to just continuously do that work while we do releases in Audacity 3. The plan is we start building the Qt version just from the very beginning. We start moving over, let's say, the waveform, the rendering of the waveform, a play button. I guess that's how we might start. We're actually planning this at the moment. And then based on how long that takes and based on what else we discover along the way and any other awkwardness we discover along the way, we gradually come to understand how long that's going to take. So so our plan at the moment is to keep doing that and build that up. And while we're doing that, keep building features in version 3. It becomes very interesting, becomes a really tough Sudoku puzzle because, as I've mentioned, building UI stuff, in particular, anything to do with interactions in version 3 is quite tough. So there are features we can build in 3 that won't have a giant impact on 4, but just like throw a feature out there. It's not anything we're thinking of building anytime soon. But imagine we wanted to build, I don't know, piano roll or very sophisticated interactions with the spectrogram. We would not really want to do that in version 3 because we then have to strip that out and rebuild it entirely in version 4 all over again, you know? But there are certain types of features, like, for example, the one thing I want to do soon enough is allow clips to overlap each other. We think that probably wouldn't have a massive impact on version 4. I may be wrong, but that's currently what we're thinking. So there's a lot of, and also there's one thing we also definitely don't want to do. We don't want to leave it like a year or 2 years before people have a release of Audacity. So we have to, for a while, we have to kind of do these two things in tandem. And the aim is when we do make the jump, and it's probably going to be, let's call it Audacity 4, why not? When we make the jump to Audacity 4, we don't want that to be a jump that includes a whole bunch of new features and capabilities. We want that to be a lateral jump where the only thing that updates is the UI, so that the app is exactly how people remember it, with maybe a couple of things moved around. And we're doing all that moving around now in version 3 to make that as, you know, sort of unremarkable in a good way for users, you know, so that the UI has changed. Oh, that's neat. Okay, I'll continue. And we just don't want the experience to feel that different, you know. But for us, it'll be, you know, night and day, because we'll be able to work 10 times more quickly and build whatever we want and, you know, have much more sophistication.
Martin, you mentioned icon clarity, so I have to ask you about the 6 magnifying glasses.
Or 7, depending on how you look at it.
Oh, we managed to take away one of those recently.
Yeah, I noticed I thought there were 7 before, and I only see 6 now, so I guess golf clap, maybe?
Well, I wish we. This is the problem with podcasts, isn't it? One of the sort of missions that we have at the moment is one of the more sort of short-term missions is to get rid of what we're calling the modes, and you can see that we've already got rid of 2. The rest of them are all about to go shortly. So there is a button that lets you select audio. There's a button there used to be a button that let you move audio. That's gone because now we've given little headers on the audio so you can just click on them and move them. There was a magnifying glass tool, which basically turned on a mode of magnifying glass. It prevented you from selecting audio, and it just meant you had to click on the audio and then it zoomed in, and then right click and then it zoomed out, or something like that, or hold a shortcut and then it zoomed out. But you already had all these other magnifying glass tools for zooming in and zooming out. And we just knew from testing that people kept going, oh, I'll zoom in on my score. They click on the magnifying glass. It didn't zoom in. Oh, what's happening? Oh, no, I can no longer select my score. Oh, now I'm zooming in. Damn, you know, what's going on? And it's that kind of like, oh dear, I'm now in a different context and I have no idea how I got here. And then they don't realize which of the tools is the tool you click on to go back and be able to select the audio again. I've come across that so many times. And the way to get rid of it is just get rid of the concept of modes. So there's another mode which has a little pen icon on it. And the pen icon is usable when you're hyper zoomed in at the sample level, where you're looking at individual samples, and the only thing the pen can do is increase or decrease the scale of a sample. And you don't need that to be a mode. You could just do that by zooming in. And then the funny thing is there's another thing called the multi-tool. It's the last one of those modes. And the multi-tool is all the other tools on at once. That's its function. The fact that you can turn on all the other tools at once and they can all work together means that the multi-tool isn't necessary. In fact, none of them are necessary. You can just turn them on all the time and get rid of all the buttons. It just needs to look a little nicer. So that's an ongoing mission. And we've already got rid of 2, and the other 3 will be much easier to get rid of.
I just want to say, as a Control 1, Control 3 person, I feel very thankful to have bypassed a lot of this issue. One more question, going back to, you know, cross-platform GUI toolkits and so forth. In the context of kind of driving adoption by new users, and especially more casual users, do you think there's something of a perception problem that you have to overcome with people who, say, download Audacity for the first time and fire it up and see an application that is not styled natively exactly like their operating system that they're familiar with? Like, do you think that you have to do work there to kind of like, you know, on a per Mac OS or Windows basis to kind of like make it look more native, to just sort of ease people in who aren't as maybe technically savvy?
To be honest with you, I just think about all my favorite applications. I don't believe one of them uses native UI, and I'm obviously including proprietary software as well. But like, yeah, no, I don't think that that really is an obstacle for most people. Unless your app is relying on, let's say, Mac specific type of patterns, which most don't, to be honest with you. The only one I can think of that I've ever used is Sketch. Sketch is very much built like it's a native app on Mac. But I actually think we should go in the opposite direction. I think that the Windows, Mac, and Linux version should all look identical, with the only difference being the way you close, minimize, and maximize the app should be, consistent with however the operating system operates, or sorry, whatever patterns or the operating system uses. I personally do not think that it has any bearing whatsoever on whether someone can use the app. I think some people might prefer it, but I think they'd be in vast minority. I think you're much better off just focusing on making sure the app is really, really easy to understand, is very decluttered, that options are labeled properly, and that if you click on something, you don't get, a kind of a weird, oh, what happened now sort of confusion experience. So for us, even now we're thinking the Windows version looks and behaves, well, much better than the Mac version. We should just ditch the weird Mac theming, which is completely, it looks so bad, and just use the Windows theming. It just looks better, and people will thank us for it. I don't think anyone will go, oh, it now looks more inconsistent, even more inconsistent with my Mac than it did before. I really don't see that happening, So yeah, so I am not a believer in following native patterns, including stuff like, I don't have any time for this idea that the yes and no or the accept decline buttons in like a dialogue should follow the pattern of your OS, because famously Windows put them in one order and Mac do in the reverse order. I don't think it matters a damn. We experience using like websites and stuff and mobile phones an incessant jumble of these two options, and we just look at them and go, that's yes, that's no, I'll click on that. I don't think people go, oh, I always click to the right. It's just not what people do. So yeah, some people get really hung up about these things. I don't think it matters one little bit.
I think some of that stuff mattered more 20 years ago than it does now too, right? I'm curious, we're the first person we've spoken to that maintains a project that started from the UI kind of UX side. And I'm curious what I know there's no average day, but what is your breakdown of time on like admin stuff for the different projects, actually doing the thing that you started out doing, and kind of the general business versus the general business of corralling a large open source project?
I wear a reasonable number of hats. It's kind of changed over time. Like initially when I joined, I was very much, I would kind of say, okay, guys, I need like 2 months. I'm going to go and I'm going to interview users. I'm going to sit with like Adobe Illustrator or Figma or one of these, and I'm going to sit down and I'm going to map out every single feature that exists in this app and make sure I understand every single one of them. And then I'm going to start the crazy jigsaw puzzle of figuring out where all those things should go, what more kind of mature patterns exist and how those can all be rationalized in a way that would make much more sense, etc. And I have done that I did that for Muse Score, and I have done that for Audacity, but I kind of feel like a lot of that work is done. So I do get very, very heavily, I get very deep into the interaction stuff and how something should work and how something should be designed, because like UX is everything in a crowded market. If you have 2 free applications and one of them's a bit of a pain to use and the other one's just got this, I just click on something and it just works, that's going to be the winner. And for me, it just has to be like that. I get very, very, I spend a lot of time with our designers, making sure, reviewing what they're doing and kind of, going, oh, I think you could push this a little bit further. Let's make that a little bit easier. I do a lot of that stuff. I do a lot of hiring. That's just going out. And I use a lot of my sort of social media following to see if I can, find people who are currently looking for a job who have audio experience or who have experience, let's say, developing other audio applications or developing other notation applications. So I do a lot of hiring stuff and interviewing. And I do a lot of like, large scale sort of road mapping. So here's a like, if you think about it like a tech tree, like you're playing Civilization 4 or something. In order to get to this, we need to build this feature, these features. We need to invest in this technology. We need to, in the case of Audacity, re-platform to Qt before any of these things will be possible. And a lot of that is really just sitting down with the people who are experts in various different areas and going, well, what needs to be done in what order? And then thinking about how that fits in with the features we want to build and what users might be expecting. And packaging that all together into one big gigantic plan, making sure everyone's happy with it, and then executing it. I am less and less involved in execution every day. Execution being testing, grabbing the build and testing it myself, although I do still do a lot of that stuff, because I think that the second you stop using the app you're working on, you become so divorced from it, it becomes more like an academic exercise, and then you just start making bad decisions. So it's kind of it's also another rule for me where maybe I'm not testing every single day, but I now force myself to use Audacity for, let's say, my YouTube videos. I force myself to use Muse Score for my composition. I do actively do these things all the time, so I'm always using these applications, and I think that keeps my head in the game. And it makes sure if you're the user, that's the best thing you can possibly be for the app. Is there anything else I do in particular? I do a lot of marketing stuff too. Marketing is maybe not the right word, because marketing for me has this connotations of making crappy ads and booking ad slots and, and all this kind of stuff. I just do a lot of interacting with the public, shouting about what we're building. Sometimes I do little videos, on my YouTube channel about what we're building and why. I do a lot of tutorial stuff, and I do a lot of release videos to describe to people, what we're building. I also build up our social media a lot. Like, for example, I built up our YouTube channel and make sure that all these things are kind of fitting together. For example, when you open up Audacity now, every time there's a new major release, there's a video, that you see that you can click on, which is usually around 2 minutes long, that breaks down for you not just what the features are, but quickly how they work.
I love those, just for the record. It's a lovely, lovely way to get a quick, faster than you can read the blog post even rundown of what's new in the update.
That little 3.2 video, that little 3 minute, just here's what's new, and here is a visual representation of it all, so you can actually see what it is. That was super helpful.
Oh, I'm glad. And the thing is as well, that takes you to YouTube. And then if you want to, you can then subscribe to YouTube, and then that builds up a YouTube audience. So we started with 0. I think we have about 26 or 27,000 subscribers. Now it's not massive numbers, but we just keep doing that. And then over a period of time, that means that more and more people are subscribed, and then that your reach is bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's what I mean by marketing. It's not, maybe not marketing is not the right word.
It's community work, really.
Pulling it all together so that the maximum amount of people are aware of the things you're building. It's not saying something you're not doing. It's not blagging or pretending that you're, changing the world or whatever. It's just good communication. But I kind of think that that supplants traditional marketing massively, so I make sure to focus on that too. I guess one other thing, I train a lot of people. So I train a lot of people on the different teams to do the things that I currently do, so that I can focus on other things. As I say, my job keeps morphing. Yeah, so that and also I guess from time to time a call needs to be made. Should we include this in the release or not? It's not ready. Is this bug a critical bug or not? And a lot of bug triage. I do a ton of bug triage, just going through. Sometimes it spends hours at it, just going through GitHub and the hundreds and hundreds of issues, and maybe I might get 30 done in a day. Sometimes just go through it, understand what it is. Sometimes I even go in and I strip out comments that are irrelevant, that will confuse the developers, so that they can fix the issue more quickly and stuff like that. I do a lot of that stuff too.
How many people are on the team internally versus external community contributors?
In Audacity, let me think. There are. I often think. I might get in trouble for saying this. I often think that there are core community contributors, as in people who always turn up. They're always there. They almost feel like they're a member of our team. They actually do feel like they're a member of our team. We have about 4 or 5 of those in the community. And then there are a lot of other people that just every once in a while, they'll just contribute something, sometimes major things, And I sometimes don't even know. I sometimes just completely miss it. One of our lead developers, our lead developer told me about a year ago that one community member just came out of the blue and did a whole lot of preparatory work that allowed us to eventually release a native version, for the M1 Mac. And he said it was really, really, really good submission. So we used that as the starting off point to make sure that, Audacity would work natively on Apple Silicon. And I'd never heard of this person again. He just turned up, made this contribution and left. And that happens quite a lot too. Also the translators, that's the thing. That's probably the thing if I try to describe to someone why open source is so amazing, or open source software, it's just translations. There are about 45, I don't know how many translators there are, but they're Audacity is reliably translated into about 30 to 45 languages. Maybe the final 15, they're not 100% translated or whatever. But yeah, when we get a release out, we usually do a string freeze. That's it. No more changes to any kind of text. We inform the translators, and then they just pile in every single time. And they go, right, here's the latest updates. And before you know it, we have we're translated fully into 20 different languages, and then the rest sort of stragglers sort of come along over the next couple of days. It's absolutely amazing. And also it's the same for Muse Group.
That's incredible.
Just a little more background on where things are at right now in terms of the players involved. So Audacity has been around for 22 years, I think, roughly. Probably just about everybody listening to this knows what it is and maybe has used it at some point. But the Muse Group, MuseScore, everybody that's sort of currently running the project only came into the picture in the last 2-3 years.
Yes, I think it's been about 2 years since I joined the project. Not quite, almost 2 years. I think I started about November. Two years ago, and I only really made an announcement that I was involved about 6 months later.
Could you give us just a little more background on what the Muse Group is, what its kind of mission statement is, what the nature of the organization is?
So Muse is a collection of different music apps and also websites that usually just contain sheet music of different descriptions or guitar tablature. Essentially, we're a digital publisher. So Ultimate Guitar is just a collection of, well, it has sheet music on it, usually for guitar, but also loads and loads of tabs, obviously. And most of the content's free, and then there's licensed content there as well. They have deals with different, rights holders for and record labels and stuff, so that if you want to get, I don't know, a tab for Smells Like Teen Spirit or something, if you want to get like a sheet music for it, you can get a subscription in order to get in order to download that. So it's very community driven as well. So it's got a large community of people who also upload their own interpretations or tabs of well-known songs or of their own work. MuseScore.com, which is a separate thing to the desktop app called MuseScore, which is about creating sheet music. That's just a very large, it's the largest website of online sheet music. And again, as a lot of it's community driven, there's a lot of content there. Most of the content is either people's original works, but there's a lot of public domain stuff, and you can just grab that stuff for free and download it and use it whatever way you want. But there's also licensed stuff as well. So we have deals with different publishers, and we have a lot of scores of, works that are in copyright. And again, if you want to get that, you get a subscription, and it's basically an all-you-eat buffet at that point. That's how Muse makes its money. It's all about content, digital content. One good example of sort of the ecosystem would be the MuseScore desktop app is, it's a free GPL open source project. And my goal is to make that as capable as possible, to really make it the best notation editor out there. Because the more people that use it, the more capable it is, the better the online content that will eventually, only a very small portion of people will actually ever publish anything to MuseScore.com. But we want to enable that as much as humanly possible. It's in our interest to make it better than any other competitor out there and keep it free and open source. Because we don't make the money from the creation apps, we make the money from the very small portion of people who decide to publish on one of our platforms. And it's the same deal with Audacity. We want to make Audacity better and better at creating different types of content. And we have, and that it's a bit more complicated there. There are different advantages it can have. For example, if you wanted to, let's say, produce something that you've created using MuseScore, or produce something that you've created using Ultimate Guitar, there's a million different features in Ultimate Guitar. We wanted to have in our house a free and open source application that just lets you do that. That doesn't impose any restrictions on you. That doesn't, hit no features hidden behind a paywall or anything like that. So and if you want to know the sort of different applications that are in that Muse is in charge of, well, there's MuseScore.com, there's MuseScore, which I work on, the desktop app, Audacity, another new fledgling website called Audio.com, Ultimate Guitar, another thing called Muse Class, which is a sort of an app for mainly a US education sort of application, and StaffPad, who joined not too long ago. It's an application it's a notation application for iPad and for tablet, Windows tablet. Yeah, so we're very much a music company, and we've, generally speaking, the attitude and the mission statement is to allow for free creation of artwork. And at the moment, we're focused on music primarily.
It sounds like Muse Group's interest was, hey, there's this big hole in our pipeline, and if we have a tool like Audacity in that pipeline, it'll help us close that gap.
To a certain extent. I mean, for example, we know that people often export, let's just call them stems, not really the correct term, but stems from orchestral scores that they're writing in MuseScore, and they might export those. And in order for them to do anything with that, they would have to bring it into like a Logic Pro, or I guess they bring it into a Reaper or Ardour or something. But we wanted something that we created ourselves, or that where we could make that sort of transition easier for people. And also we wanted something where people could publish their own, let's say, podcasts or other, or eventually music or other types of content. So yeah, it sort of fits nicely into, I guess, our wheelhouse, because we didn't have an audio editor or anything close to it. We had a notation app, and that was really, and one other notation app for tablet, and they were our two creation apps. And we felt like, well, nearly all of our applications have audio content of some kind. So we really should have something that's also free that allows you to sort of produce that audio, or master it, or export it in different formats, etc. And Audacity seemed like the perfect fit there.
Curious if you could give us some more detail, I guess, about what it means for an organization like the Muse Group to kind of quote unquote acquire a long running open source project. I mean, is that primarily just a situation of kind of taking possession of like trademark and logo, and because this is an application that's always existed under the GPL, so the code is always going to be open and free. So it almost seems like it's more like a situation of stewardship, maybe, rather than it's not like evil corporation absorbing this previously free thing. It's more like you're just kind of shepherding its future.
Yeah, exactly. We don't. It's still under the GPL. Anyone can still do whatever they want with it, with anything that we contribute. We being sort of the internal, sort of professional team, we own the rights to the copyright, the trademark. Exactly. We do also have the keys to the GitHub account, so we can choose what gets merged and what doesn't get merged, etc. That's it.
At the end of the day, if the community doesn't like what you're doing, somebody can go fork the project, call it something else, and move on whatever path they want, right?
Yeah, which is another good point as well. Which we just back to the evil corporation thing. Let's just say we decided to do something really evil. Well, every single thing we've done up until now, all of that can just be forked and taken away from us. So the moment we do something like, let's say, something stupid like, we're going to charge for Audacity. Well, that's it. We're done. It's already out there. Someone can just grab it. We have no control over that.
It's one of the things that's come up again and again. I mean, we've talked to a wide range of projects, some people that are really well funded and some people that are, kind of constantly scraping by, and, these enormous projects that are used by millions of people or billions of people around the world, even in some cases, are running on fumes, basically. And usually, not always, I guess, because there's always exceptions, but often when I hear, hey, some big corporation has decided to start funding an open source project, it's almost always a good thing because it means that there's more resources for something that had fewer resources before, in my experience.
Yeah, I mean, as long as they have a track record of just developing good stuff and not sort of doing insidious things or just making the experience worse.
Do you see a lot of contributions from major companies? I feel like that's something we see a lot more in open source these days. Like companies like Intel are big contributors to Linux kernel, and like companies are putting development resources against open source projects that they themselves benefit from and use. Do you get any? Like you mentioned Google's Summer of Code added a feature recently.
That's probably the only example. I mean, Google Summer Code is just one of those things we just knew about and we participated in. We did a lot of it with MuseScore, and then when I became in charge of the Audacity project, I sort of said we should really participate in Google Summer of Code. I think Audacity had participated in it before years earlier. And that's more, it's not because we need the feature built so urgently that we want, we go out of our way to try and get students on board to try and build them for us. In fact, that's really, really the most inefficient way to try and do that. Because Google Summer Code is all about trying to bring more people into the community as far as we're concerned. We could build a feature 20 times faster than a student who's never used the code base before. And mentoring that student takes a lot of time, but we do it because, generally speaking, Google Summer of Code students tend to stick around and really it sort of enriches the community. So it's actually, even though it's an investment from Google, it's actually also an investment from us. Just because it forces us to dedicate time to train up, a community member to understand the code base and that kind of thing.
Mentoring's part of, if you're going to mentor people, you should devote time to it, right?
Yeah. It's a mixture of documentation, brown bag sessions or whatever you want to call it. And just, and I think that you can kind of reach critical mass if enough developers in the community are aware of how something works. Then in some sort of chat room, someone will ask, "Oh, hey, I'm new to the project. I need to get started. What do I need to know?" And if they come across problems like compiling for the first time or something, then there'll usually be someone on hand in the community to kind of help them out. And I think that's we always try to make sure that that's topped up, and that we continuously make sure that we're contributing to that. We working with the open source communities, it's an extra dimension. Which if you kind of just ignore them and you don't tell them what you're doing, you don't involve them in the roadmaps that you're developing, then they won't know what to build and they won't know what to focus on, and then the community will stagnate if you do that. So yeah,
communication's the hard part, huh?
It can be. I mean, definitely. And I thought I knew how to do it until I started on MuseScore. We've had a couple of situations where we're racing to get something built. And I'll go away and come up with a feature and say, okay, this feature is incredibly important. This should be the next one on our roadmap. And someone's in the middle of building it, and then out of nowhere, some community member I've never heard of before suddenly goes, "Hey, I've got this idea for a feature. I've built it and I've submitted it." That happens a lot. People just going, "I'm not going to talk to anyone. I think this feature should exist. I'm making an assumption that no one else is working on it, so I'm just going to build it myself." And it has happened where literally two not identical builds come together and their work just basically has to be trash. I mean, trash is a nasty word. I hate saying that, but it's just true. Like their work basically just can't get merged. We built a more sophisticated version of what they're doing, or we're making a change that makes their change unmergeable or something like that. And that's a real shame. Thankfully, we don't really have those problems anymore. But the way to get around that is just publish let them know what you're doing. Just say, here's a bunch of things we're going to be doing for the next year. Here's our plans. We'll be making technical changes to this. So you be careful if you're making changes to this yourself. And in that way, then people, you avoid that problem. That's a real killer, and that's really, really upsetting when that happens, because obviously I think it's safe to say if a community member spends 4 months working on a personal project thinking it's going to change the world and then finding it can't be merged because no one communicated that someone internally was working on it, then that's awful.
One more question on the kind of community management front. Would you say that relations with the community are pretty positive these days? I mean, you or more specifically the Muse Group had kind of a trial by fire when you first came onto the project with this kind of like sensationalized idea that got passed around social media, like, oh, Audacity is spyware now, which turned out to seemingly be pretty nonsensical, but like that can't have been a fun introduction to working on the project. Or things better on that front?
It was frustrating for me because it I'd already been working on like a very visible open source project for almost 2 years at that point. Well, no, about a year and a half at that point, and I never experienced anything like that. And it was utterly bizarre. I mean, I guess just because you've mentioned it, it's completely untrue. I mean, untrue. There is absolutely no bones on that whatsoever. The idea that it's spyware. It's also like, it just seems to me so insane to think that it could be true or to veer in that direction, because why would a company invest so much time and effort into an app to make it illegally spy on you and then go and write that into a privacy policy document? Hey, we're going to do something illegal, but let's make sure we put it in a privacy policy document so that everyone knows about it. That alone should have made people go, But the thing is, they don't know. No one knows who we are. And, they just see that someone kicked up a fuss about it on Reddit. And then people on BBC go, there is a fuss being raised on Reddit and the accusation being leveled is spyware. We have no idea what Audacity is or who's building it. We just see the word spyware and that it's trending. Let's just pop that on our newsfeed, And then that happens across the board. And then before you know it, I've got friends who read that on the BBC going, what's this about you making spyware? And it's just like, what? Stop. This is insane. But, also at the same time, that was a big communications problem with us. We were caught so flat-footed by that. So the second... it actually started with a community member in completely good faith looking at a draft privacy policy that was written by one of our lawyers, which was a pretty poorly written privacy policy, it has to be said, meaning it's just totally ambiguous legalese nonsense. It also had some provisions in there that shouldn't have been there, like about 13-year-olds can't use the app, or we would advise you if you're 13 or younger not to use the app, which is something you do with an app that has user accounts. It was basically lifted from a privacy policy for a website where that's standard, And it wasn't a published privacy policy that actually applied to any existing version of Audacity. It was kind of a draft that had been put together. So we asked the community to look over it and tell us what they thought. One guy came back and published on GitHub Discussions, I have a bunch of problems with the privacy policy. Here they are. Let me just itemize them. And we kind of looked at it and we were like, yeah, we were also wondering about that. We better get back to the lawyers and sort of get clarification. Now, at that point, had I just written like a little statement or a little comment going, let's get back to you about that, take down the privacy policy and go, yeah, you're right, this is actually a bit weird. Not that any of it's true, like the stuff about like we're spyware, which is like just an amazing sort of abstraction from the initial problem someone had, which was this is ambiguous. This line sounds like you're doing something bad, even though, it's just some stupid legalese. I don't want to go into all the details, but if I just sort of said, listen, you're absolutely right. I also think that this is probably just not something you publish. It's way too ambiguous. Let's go back to the lawyers and we'll get back to you. Promise. Give us a couple of days, take down the privacy policy. That would have been the end of it, But we didn't. We were rushing. We were still kind of newbies to the project. We still hadn't fleshed out our team. We kind of sent a message to the lawyers in the US to get back to us about it, and then it just sort of exploded overnight. People just jumped on the initial thread, and they started also looking through other things that were in the privacy policy and going, hold on a second, if you put this statement together with that statement, it means that they're stealing your information, and oh my God, and they're storing it, and this is like spyware, and it just sort of metastasized into this crazed sort of set of accusations. And then we were just on the defensive, and once you're on the defensive, there's nothing you can do. I know from experience, just this experience, we told them this is not true. Like, categorically, it's not true. And also, just check the bloody code, you know? Like, if it's spyware, it'll be in the code. It's an open source project. Just check it out. And then a couple of people did, and they were like, I think this is overblown. But they were just completely, it didn't matter at that point. But anyway, to answer your point, it doesn't really happen anymore. We've got a few releases out now, and it's all sort of died down. I think it was very much gee whiz, there's a brilliant story here. I mean, it is actually kind of a brilliant story. You know, evil corporation come in, take over open source audio app, ... probably listening to you, ... spyware, ... profit. It's brilliant. You know, it's a perfect conspiracy theory. Yeah, and I think once the fervor died down, people kind of lost interest and then just moved on to something else, you know?
It always makes me crazy, though, because the only thing an evil corporation can do to an open source project is to close the code and start changing it, right? At the end of the day, because at the end of the day, if you don't like what the corporation's doing, you fork the project and you move on. You do something anyway.
And like we are fully aware of that. Like, you know, we've this is not our first massive open source project. You know, we're aware if we screw up, people fork the code and we're done. You know, our eyes are open. So it's just But the thing is, they don't know us. They don't know anything about us. You know, they just they hear corporation involved with open source project and they immediately jump to the worst possible conclusions. But yeah, but that's not to say that, you know, we could have avoided it.
So in the early days of Audacity, there weren't a lot of options for affordable audio editing. I think famously at one point, Audacity was the only audio editor that worked on the Mac that wasn't something that Apple provided. And that's definitely not true now. You know, there's a bunch of other really high quality audio editors across a wide spectrum of prices. And I'm curious what you think has been the core part of Audacity that's continued to find support for both users and for the continued development of the project.
As in, why is it still so used and
yeah, is there something inherent to the project that gets people excited about it and gets people invested in it?
I always liked Audacity, and I always had it on every one of my machines. It was just this dependable little thing, and it's like VLC. That'd be the thing I compare it to most. It's just, I just know it's going to work. I know it's going to be able to open anything. And I always just felt quite warmly towards it, and I knew it was made for free and everything. But besides that, as I mentioned, UX is everything. It has a lot of good things going for it. If you open it up, there's a big bloody record button there, and you can press it, and it starts recording immediately onto a track. And something about the look and feel of it just feels right. It also feels kind of dependable. I don't know, the way it looks like the people who made it kind of know what they're doing in terms of, I know that sounds so ridiculous, but I think it's actually really important. You need to have faith in the application that you're using. And I've seen a couple of other, you know, audio kind of recording / editing bits of software out there, and I just don't like them. It's hard to even put my finger on why, even though they do the same thing. There's just something about the way that it's put together or some weird quirk that makes me go, I just don't like this as much. I just would prefer to use Audacity. It's got the right combination of colors, buttons, features, and information that just make it feel like the right app to use. You know, I also think that like the ability to select audio and zoom in on it and convert to a different file format, they just nailed that, I think. It's also got the best name. That can't hurt. It's very memorable. So yeah, so for all this talk about, you know, improving the UX and clunkiness, it has something special going on, and I really do think it is a little bit of one of those kind of more than the sum of its parts type of thing. There's something about it that just makes it feel a little bit nicer than, let's say, you know, whatever Sony SoundForge is now called, you know. And it feels, even now, way nicer to use than Audition, let's say. I mean, I have Audition, and I just don't like using it. It's just a big, ugly, clunky, overly complex for no reason. Well, not for no reason. It's just overly complex. It's kind of annoying and unpleasant app to use. Whereas Audacity, you know, except where it kicks up on you and it doesn't do what you want it to do. Generally speaking, when you're using it for what it's for, it does it rather well, you know, and I think that plays into it a lot.
I think one of our Discord viewers described it as a workhorse. So, yeah.
Speaking of our Discord, I'm going to slip one user question in here before we let you go. Do you plan to add automation now that real-time effects are supported?
Yes, 100%.
Oh, cool. Could you give us any details about like what form that'll take, like some scripting, or is that more of a visual automation, or is it too early to say?
Definitely want to have visual automation, and I don't know if we'll be able to achieve this because it's a tough nut to crack. But I'd love for automation to, just to be clear, I'm talking about, okay, you've added a real-time effect and it has a particular parameter in it that makes, let's say, reverb, makes it more echoey or something. And I'd like that to tweak that over time That's what we're talking about. And just being able to automate any parameter, volume, panning, gain, whatever, and any other parameter within an effect. I definitely want to have a very visual version of that, so that you can click on the waveform and move up and down a little line that visually represents the state of the parameter. And I also want to try and do it in a way where we can expose it to people who maybe have never heard of that before, never even really knew it was a thing. A lot of people who use Audacity will, just by definition, they will be used to the idea of selecting a bit of audio and applying an effect to it, right, destructively. Yeah, so I really want to try and design automation in a way so that someone who's never come across it before, or who has ever used, let's say, another app that has automation, would discover it and figure out how it works. I'm pretty confident in saying that if you asked someone, if you gave someone the end goal of tweaking an effect over time in any app that exists at the moment, like a Logic Pro or something, they would never figure out how to do it without a tutorial first. Even the term automation gives very, very little clue as to what it's for. And usually it's represented in this really abstract icon, 2 circles combined with joined by a line, or 3 circles joined by a line, and that's not clear what that does either. I'd love to be able to have a little breadcrumb trail, and you can kind of see that we've started that. There's a button that says effects next to the track. You click the effects button, it opens up a sidebar. Oh, a sidebar is opened, right? What does that do? And then in the sidebar is a little bit of text that goes, you can add effects here, and there's a little video to describe how those effects work. And you click on the big plus button, and then that shows you a list of effects. So it's a little bit of a breadcrumb trail. It's built in a way so that can be discovered, not so that people who already know what that is can now have the opportunity to use it. We're trying to focus on the people who've maybe never discovered this before. What I really want to try and do, and I'm not certain if we'll be able to achieve it, but you should always, shoot for the moon when it comes to UX and hope for the best. And at least you'll get it to be as usable as possible. I'd love for the next step then to be, okay, you've applied an effect. Do you know that that reverb effect, you can tweak that over time? Because I think that automation itself is a very easy concept once you understand it and once you know it's possible. I don't think it's very easy to discover. I don't think it ever has been. I'd love to be able to make it discoverable in a very visual way. And then you can build the more sort of technical features later. I'm very much about focusing on what is clearly the majority of the Audacity users who aren't very technical. They maybe are using Audacity just because they need it maybe every once in a while or something like that. We want to bring those people along and also reveal to them these kinds of really amazing tools that you can get with more sort of quote unquote professional sort of applications.
I think you taught me more about automation in the last 4 minutes than I've learned in 5 years of using Audition. So congratulations. Martin, where can people find more information about Audacity, MuseScore, what links do you want to share? And we'll make sure that people get them.
I think the most important one is to come to my YouTube channel, which is called, my online moniker is Tantacrul, Tantacrul. And I have a YouTube channel where I talk about sort of musical concepts and composition and music technology and stuff like that. I have talked about both MuseScore and Audacity on that channel before. I have a video coming up about MuseScore 4 and how we made it. And if you are very interested in MuseScore, in downloading the app for writing MuseScore, I would say go to musescore.org, where you can get it and install it right away. If you are an Audacity user, or if you want to find Audacity, well, probably the fastest way is just type Audacity into Google. But what you also can do is go to audacityteam.org, and that'll take you on the homepage. You'll see a big download button, and if you click that, it'll automatically download the right version for your operating system. Audacityteam.org and MuseScore.org both have links to the communities there, so you can find our forums and stuff for either product, and you can also find your way to our Discord channels. We have a Discord server. We have 2 for Audacity, one more for users and one for contributors. So if you want to contribute, it's pretty straightforward to find the Discord server where we chat about where we discuss the making of the app. And the same thing for MuseScore. We have a Discord server for that too, and a user-focused Discord server. So yeah, I guess those are the most important places people can go.
So that's Audacity. Thanks again to Martin for coming by and spending some time chatting with us. It was really informative, and I think I both understand the project and where it's going and kind of the business behind the support that has come with this transition better than I did before.
Yes, and in case it didn't make it into the final edit of this interview, I am excited to now know how to pronounce cute.
We think.
because I've been going around saying QT all this time.
I have heard it both ways, so
Okay.
like I think there's some ambiguity there. You never know, right?
Hey man, anything goes in open source. You want to say it a different way, just fork the project and change the name.
There you go. But make it the exact same name, but just pronounce it different. That's the
Yes.
key.
Oh, you really want to go all the way, make it a recursive acronym.
No more recursive acronyms, please. Brad, as always, this week's episode of the FOSSPod is brought to you by Google Open Source. They bring all the value of open source to Google and all the resources of Google to open source. As always, Matt Purdy produced this episode and Sabrina Hill edited it. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Brad, did you find the project?
I'm hot on the trail of this computer music final project that I got an A on in college that I am almost positive I used Audacity for 20 years ago. I haven't quite found it yet, but maybe stay tuned to a future episode.
The timing works out. As always, if you have questions, you can send them into fosspod@content.town. We've gotten a handful of really good ones, and we're looking for more. We'd like to do a Q&A episode later this year, so we can kind of go back to the folks we've talked to before and see if there's any bows that you'd like to put on old episodes. And we will be back in 2 weeks with another episode of the FOSSPod. Thanks for listening, everybody.